Very good. For those that have just joined, thank you so much for tuning in. I always find it striking when people want to sign in and listen to my ugly mug talk for a little bit, but also have some fun interactive polls in here from Slido. I think probably everybody's familiar with Slido at this point. If you're unfamiliar with me, my name is Jake Newton. I'm the Chief of Operations for CPPS. And I cut my teeth in the United States military, doing what the private sector effectively would be the equivalent of crisis management, travel risk management. If you're familiar with the career field, I was a SEER specialist. Came into the private sector, have pretty well been with CPPS ever since, which was back in 2014 when I joined this business. And did a short tenure with a travel assistance company as well. And if you're unfamiliar with CPPS, we're a consultancy, a training services firm where we kind of have two hats that we wear for our clients and helping them build programs and deal with the issues of one being violence, workplace violence, but violence as a whole, targeted intentional violence, affective violence, all the things. The other side is travel risk management. And what I want to talk about with y'all during this time is what did we learn from 2025? What are some of the key insights that we can use and leverage as we look to the new year? And also give some of my thoughts on what we might expect next year and maybe into the more distal future, given some of these trends that we're experiencing and some of the things that are kind of percolating on the horizon. But ultimately, I want y'all to walk away from this with a few extra tools to help you keep your people safe. Um, I love people. If you're here, you probably love people as well. And a lot of us in this profession have the requirement or the privilege to look after the safety and security of others. And leveraging what we've seen this year and even in other years past as well, looking at some of the data, some of the compliance issues, really leveraging this information and understanding for how we can better do these kinds of activities into the future. And so I'm going to have some real tangible tips towards the end of what all of this means and how we can reflect these different things into our program. Um, I already see the first question. Will there be a recording? There absolutely will be a recording. We'll make sure everybody gets this in email. And we'll also have some other materials that we'll send out afterwards as well. If you do have questions, I don't know if question and answer from Zoom is actually turned on, but for sake of simplicity, just throw stuff in the chat. I'll hit it as we're going through, and of course, we'll have a time at the end as well. But if you don't have your phone available, or even if you're on your browser, grab one of those two things or access one of those two things. We're going to use Slido. I've actually got a couple of prompts coming right up in a moment. But effectively, go to the browser. Q&A is turned on. Okay, very good. Thank you. Um, Go to slido.com. You can put in that hashtag, the hash code rather, or you can zap the QR code. And what's going to happen is when I go to a few slides, you'll see a prompt display on the screen if you're new with Slido. And it's going to allow us to interact with the material. I think I've got 4 of them throughout our time together, maybe 5. Um, and so you'll see, how the audience polls on some of these different considerations. It's a really fun way to engage with the material and benchmark with others in the audience a little bit. For everybody's edification, we've got healthcare present, we've got corporate America present, we've got schools present, a lot of higher ed out of that batch. We've got some government present, state and local. So I'm going to do my best for y'all to kind of tailor this conversation to some of those things, but what you'll find is it'll be kind of more of a, for a lack of a better term, kind of a broad stroke to just try to make sure that this information applies to everybody. So without further ado, let's get into this. Looking back at 2025. So here's your first prompt for Slido. If you missed the initial QR code, you can hit it here on this one. But what was y'all's biggest challenge, primarily as it relates to behavioral issues, violence issues? What was y'all's biggest challenge that you saw throughout 2025? Let's see what is kind of coming up to the mix here. So threats and threatening behavior has taken the reign thus far. Not surprised by that. That was definitely an issue for us at the center. Working with clients. But it's interesting to see that it's obviously a mix as well. It's kind of all over the map. And this is what I want to dig into. I think you'll find a couple interesting anecdotes to why this might be the case. All right, so a good spread. For 4 years in a row, this is research put out. It's called the Security Benchmark Report, Security Magazine. And what they found is that for 4 years in a row now, workplace violence was the number one concern for security practitioners. Um, Not surprising to me, but I want to delve into why is this the case? Why does this continue to be rising to the top? And you can see the other examples that they have on here. But also not surprisingly, if you look, okay, so we got a tie for number two with business continuity and travel security, executive protection. I'm going to talk about that as well because I think given some of these trends that we've been seeing, one of those is threats against executives or assassinations, high profile individuals getting killed, targeted. So, if you kind of look at this issue of violence broadly, I think that's part of what we're seeing here. But what's interesting is there's a continued trend with this issue of violence rising to the top. So, why is this the case? Let's delve into this. Now, we don't have the 2025 data yet, but what's interesting is the FBI's report. I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with this. The FBI's report is actually showing a steady decrease in cases. Will that be the case for 2025? I don't know. I think it'll probably be pretty close to 2024. But it's wonderful that we are seeing a decrease in these events happening. And I think this is partially because we're actually getting ahead of these issues. We're implementing behavioral threat assessment and management capabilities. There's a wider societal understanding and awareness of these issues. And I think the tolerance for these issues is generally going down. So everybody's asking the question, what in the world can we do about it? But it's kind of interesting when, we think about the issue of workplace violence, whenever we teach classes with clients, we'll kind of ask the question, when you think of workplace violence, what comes to mind? And all the time we hear active shooter or active assailant rise to the top as one of the more prevailing answers. So it's kind of interesting how the perception today is remaining that that's one of the number one issues, or that's what people equate workplace violence to. But we are seeing a positive downward trend in that regard. So I want to pull on this thread a little bit and let's go to less extreme behavior. So some of you saw on that recent poll, incivility was one of those things that some of you were experiencing most throughout 2025. So how many of y'all, when we're talking about incivility, let's go a little bit further down the behavioral spectrum here. How many of you think on a daily basis in the United States, acts of incivility occur? Another Slido poll. So we got a couple on here for 110 million. Any other guesses? So a little all over. This is great. 25 million a day, 70 million a day, 52 million a day. All great guesses. So I think y'all will find this interesting. This is SHRM research. They actually have an ongoing report that they publish based upon incivility. And 70 million acts occur per day in the workplace. So on the one hand, we have acts of extreme violence decreasing. That's wonderful. On the other hand, there's still this concern, this stress, this understanding that, as the research showed a few minutes ago, violence is one of the bigger issues that we're still experiencing. And I think it's things like this that are an indicator of why this is the case. Why is incivility happening? Well, everybody I think is noticing the increasing political divide. We have media that has narratives that are all over the map that makes it hard for people to understand or what to trust in. We have what's fueling that with social media and different things. We have disinformation, misinformation. And I think with this technological age that we're in, it's defragmenting that common connection we have as people because we're more focused on digital rather than the interpersonal side of things. So a natural fallout of that is I think what we're seeing here, where people are having a difficult time interacting with each other in a respectful basis. And this, I think, is some of what we're experiencing across the spectrum when, this issue of violence on a broader scale is still rising to the top as a main concern. This is research that was recently shown. This is 2025 research from a report I always like to benchmark. It's called Stress in America by the American Psychological Association. And what they found is that, and this was also validated by the Surgeon General not terribly long ago, we have this epidemic of loneliness that the Surgeon General called it, but people are isolating from others. Okay, well, if an insulator of potential violence is good communication, feeling connected, having relationships, feeling valued. Isolation is one of those early issues that if I'm not feeling valued or if I'm feeling isolated, well, it's kind of some of these precursors that we might see that can lead towards some of these issues. And what we're seeing is based upon the sample, half of Americans or half of perhaps people globally are feeling isolated, they're feeling left out, they lack that companionship with others, that friendship and that relationship with others. So we can see at the earliest onset of some of these issues what people are feeling. And I'm going to explain why this is important from a violence prevention perspective. In that same report, we also have what are some of those most significant stressors in people's lives? If you've not read Stress in America, they do this every single year. It's really great information, particularly as security practitioners when we're trying to identify what might be the earliest cause that somebody might be doing what they're trying to do. So we can put into place tactics and different capabilities to really help people when they're struggling. What are those stressors? Well, if we look at the top one, the future of the nation, and then you got number two, you've got the economy, money is on here. So if those are stressors, what are people feeling? Well, they're feeling hopelessness towards a positive future. We're feeling stressed at work. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Politics is a stressor for 65% of people that were surveyed. That's pretty obvious. We've been noticing that for quite a while. But even still, back in 2020, I think it was the 2020 report, mass shootings was the number one stressor for Americans. It's still a significant stressor for 65% of people. So this goes back to where it's that perception. We're actually making positive trajectory in the reduction of the amount of extreme violence that's occurring. But on the other hand, it remains a significant stressor for people. Well, there's that fear that these things might occur. So we have, on the one hand, positive. On the other hand, this is kind of alarming. So how can we get in front of this information? And on the other hand of the spectrum, well, if mass shootings are also decreasing in the amount, what might be some of these types of violence that are causing the increases that we're seeing, or these areas where it's looking a little bit different? One of the things that we've been seeing at the center, particularly working with our clients, is increased issues with suicidality. Now, it's kind of interesting on this map. It looks like it's pretty flat, but when you actually look at the numbers of increase of the amounts of suicide that's occurring, this is data provided by the CDC. Uh, Suicide is steadily on an incline, and this has been true for quite a while now. But this is, I think, one of the big reasons we're seeing kind of a shift. It's not necessarily mass shootings, even though sometimes when somebody is suicidal, they may not only try to harm themselves, they might try to harm others as well. So that risk remains. But what's interesting here is when somebody tries to harm themselves, this is another way that the violence can manifest. And we're seeing this all the time because when you look at that behavioral progression, where somebody might be going on a pathway to targeted intentional violence, some of those different things that an individual do behaviorally can also be something that an individual will do when they're on a progression of potentially harming themselves. So this is interesting. So it's not necessarily, in years past where mass shootings have been the big focus and the big alarm, whether it's getting the media attention or whatever, this issue is not necessarily getting the same kind of immediate attention, but this is one of those things that can have just as significant impacts on a workplace and is actually on a steady incline here over the past several years. Compounding this is information that we have from the Gun Violence Archive. So the Gun Violence Archive, they actually have a pretty wide definition of some of the things that they capture with this information. But again, I want to look at this from the perspective of suicide. If you look at the bottom of the chart here, suicide by firearm rates are up. So back in 2015, some of the earliest data they have, it was 22,000. Now we're pushing 28,000, 27,000. 2024's data is still pending because they also receive that from the CDC. But you can see how when we look at this in the context of the workplace, this is one of those things that a lot of our clients and a lot of organizations societally are seeing across the spectrum. This is one way how violence is continuing to manifest. So there's a little bit of a shift here. How else is this looking different? Well, for those of you that are in Pennsylvania, this may be very familiar, but this is Governor Josh Shapiro's mansion that was burned and attacked. So we also have this increase in target intentional violence, politically motivated violence, and we've all seen the cases throughout this year, but there's a definite trend and an increasing trend in these kinds of attacks. Brian Thompson, late 2024. The Minnesota legislators, one killed, one severely wounded. Charlie Kirk, President Trump, Congresswoman Pelosi a couple years ago. High-profile figures, whether political figures, business executives, organizational executives. I saw some data saying that this year alone, there was like 150 to 180, depending on how you define it, either attempts or threats or these kinds of acts across the country. So this is significant because this is where we're starting to see that ideological motivation, or in some cases, we're also seeing, some of you might have noticed it's a little bit of a newer term, not that this kind of violence is newer, but nihilistic violence or nihilistic threats that are occurring. So there's a little bit of a shift in the landscape here. And I think this is why, we are seeing a positive trend in the mass shootings issue, but violence is remaining to be a top concern. So it looks a little bit different. It's manifesting different, but it remains a significant risk that organizations have to tangle with all the same. One of the other things that we noticed throughout 2025, compliance issues. I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings, if you recognize the king here. And it's a little bit misleading, so it begins, but it's kind of a fun play on words here. 2024, we had California's workplace violence law passed for general industry. We also have the New York retail law for those of you that are in New York. But one of the questions that I've been getting constantly this year, increasingly this year, is, hey, what's the latest law that's passing? What's the next law that's going to pass? And some of these things are being introduced and even not going forward. Actually, Virginia a few months ago had a law that was proposed. It went to the governor's desk. It was very similar to SB 553 out of California and was vetoed. But I think that California law is going to be a quasi template for what we're going to see increasingly over the next several years. Now, for those of you in healthcare, for those of you in schools, this is not new information. We've got a lot of laws, and in fact, even on Capitol Hill, for federal legislation, we're seeing these kinds of things continue to occur because of being a higher risk industry. Nurses and providers are being attacked and experiencing these kinds of behaviors on a very regular basis. And so that is absolutely a trend that we're seeing is throughout 2025 is a lot of laws were being passed primarily for healthcare, but this trend is also now impacting general industry. So those of you that are subject to 553 or subject to the New York retail law, um, I think this is going to be an ongoing issue for the foreseeable future, and it's not going anywhere. I mean, these laws, once they're on the books, we got to be able to wrestle with them and take care of the issues that they're stipulating. But one thing that is a probably one of the key takeaways we noticed with working with clients throughout 2025 as it relates to legislation, having a plan is not sufficient. And this is particularly true for like SB 553. This is true for the New York retail law. Now, even California put out a template plan, which is a great benchmark or even a great starting point to use for generating that initial compliance. But one of the things we have to be mindful of as practitioners is just putting the plan in place, which is a key requirement for some of these laws that we're seeing. It's the practices that you have to perform within that law or within that plan that you have to develop for your organization. So here's a couple examples that we've been helping clients work through throughout this year. I'll use the example of 553. It talks about how you have to perform scheduled periodic inspections throughout the duration of implementation of your plan. So it says periodic. It actually doesn't define how often those need to occur, but you need to be looking at every single site for risk factors or hazards as the safety vernacular would have it, but looking for at each site and having the plan tailored to each location that you're performing these inspections to make sure that these risk factors are being taken care of. That's one of the things, that's one of the bigger gaps we're seeing in an implementation standpoint. The other consideration is the laws are saying, hey, we need to have some annual training. Well, having the core training is insufficient even still. The law talks about how if there's an incident that occurs or if there's a new risk that is identified or new information, broadly speaking, that becomes available, we need to have some time and circumstance training to make sure our individuals are educated on those issues as well. So it's not simply enough to make this plan and have that plan stay on the shelf. There's a lot of practices that have to make sure that we have to make sure as practitioners that we're implementing over the course of time. So as we go into 2026, dust those bad boys off and make sure that we're staying flush on implementing all of these different requirements. But just a couple of lessons learned that we saw throughout this year. One of the things we'll be sending you after this webinar as well is we created a guide. My colleague Corey Staley and I actually published a guide that gives a pretty good overview of the legal landscape as well as all kinds of other information. We tried to be as comprehensive as we could with how to develop a modern day violence prevention intervention program. So you can have this information at your disposal and take some of the guesswork out of it because it is becoming more of a compliance and regulatory environment. So in your emails after the webinar, be looking for that. I want to talk a little bit about this standard. If you are familiar with us at CPPS and if you're familiar with ASIS, you're probably familiar with the standard. But I want to tie this into the regulatory environment that we're seeing. Why is this document so important? Well, when we've been working with clients, particularly for compliance with some of these laws that we're seeing, this document continues to be a gold standard for how you can implement the requirements of those laws. We have not had any attorneys that we've worked with push back on us and say this is an ineffective way to do this. And here's partially why. One, this is the most detailed standard for this issue to date. Two, it's globally applicable. It's consensus based. There's a lot of really great professionals that have developed this document over time. There's a lot of history and research and understanding that has gone into this. It's really, really profound. Prior to this regulatory environment we find ourselves in, this document was absent legislation. The thing that we continue to see and have seen in the past come up in the courts for civil litigation time and time and time again. And there's actually even a newer trend. I wouldn't call it a trend yet, but an anecdote that is interesting. Last year, there was a case that was tried. And if you're familiar with Dr. Russ Palarea and if you're familiar with ATAP, maybe you saw a presentation about this. But here's an interesting way that this document continues to be a very strong way to apply some of these compliance issues. A couple of years ago, in southern Idaho, there was a mass shooting at a mall. And it was tried under the general duty clause for federal OSHA. So, general duty clause recognizes workplace violence as part of our employer obligation to create a workplace free from recognized hazards. Okay, so they had a mass shooting, and what happened was the OSHA argument was they used this document as the abatement methods for how the organization should have been addressing workplace violence. So that's interesting because OSHA, federal OSHA has a document that they've released where if OSHA inspectors are coming out and they're looking at a complaint, they're looking at an investigation based upon an incident that occurred, they have a guide that they're supposed to go by for here's all of the things that we're going to be looking for throughout that investigation process. This is also significant as it relates to this document because what they were saying, in effect, is the way that you comply with the general duty clause at the federal level for workplace violence is through this issue, is through this document here. And that was based upon a mass shooting that occurred. Um, so there's a precedent set for this now, which is really fascinating. So just another way that this is a really important document to benchmark to when you're building out your program. And so us at the center, when we're working with clients, we basically superimpose the guidance of this document over the top of legal requirements as a way to implement what those laws are asking for, if that makes sense. And we found that to be received very, very well. And the beauty of this is when you look at some of the laws, the way they're written from an occupational safety kind of standpoint. They use that language, abatement methods, engineering controls, administrative controls. As security professionals, you kind of have to tie the bridge between that kind of vernacular and what we have in our space, where it's physical security, it's intervention capabilities, it's threat management, it's risk. So we're having to bridge this gap, and implementing this standard is a way that you can do that in a very, very effective means. So I see a question on here. Can somebody share the standard? If you go to asisonline.org, that's where you can access it. You do have to pay for it if you're not a member. If you are a member, you can get it for online. You can access it online for no cost. All right. Travel risk. I talked a little bit about in the beginning. How does this all apply to the travel side of things? Well, I'm sure many of you experienced probably your executive or maybe even your board of directors if you're in the business world or if you have a board for your organization coming down based upon some of the events that we've experienced this year, saying, what are we doing to protect these individuals when they are traveling? And what we've noticed is that this is also having an impact on the broader travel risk management programs as well. So I want to talk a little bit about this. And organizations we've seen wrestle with this issue because while it is another risk management program, organizations seem to tangle with it a little bit. So another poll for everybody in Slido, who manages your TRM program? And I want to break this down a little bit. I want to give you some information on how you can make this effective if this is something you're wrestling with. I'll adapt it to executive protection. I'll adapt it to travel risk management as a whole for everybody. But who's managing this program in your organization? Okay, so we have security. We've got no program. Little bit of risk management. I wonder if that's our higher ed friends. That's not common or not uncommon for that industry. Security reigns supreme. It's also common when we're working with clients, we'll actually see travel management types have a big stake. There it is in this program as well. So very good. If you are looking at this issue, this is the key benchmark for travel risk management. Now, for those of us in the United States, again, this comes back to duty of care, which is ultimately under the general duty clause. Widely defined, and it's very broad, particularly as it relates to travel risk management. ISO 31030 is an international standard. It's also published by the International Organization for Standardization. So if you're familiar with ISO 31000 risk management or 45001 for safety, occupational safety, same organization. Similarly to the ASIS standard that I talked about, this is your key standard for travel risk management. Now, whether it's travel security, generally speaking, or even travel security, travel risk management for executives, this document is going to walk you through how you can set up this process for every traveler in your organization. Now, what's key is travel risk management is not simply protecting travelers, it's also protecting the accomplishment of organizational objectives. That's why it's housed under risk management, trying to create certainty on the accomplishment of organizational objectives. So this piece is that same issue as it relates to travel. Let's dive into this a little bit. Travel risk management. This is a system, and I'm going to walk everybody through this to give you a framework of, and I'd be very happy if you want a deeper dive into this, because I understand we don't have a whole heck of a lot of time in our time here together. But this is the system that you can effectively create. This is benchmarking to the ISO, but this is also from my past life in the Department of Defense. This is based upon a model from that. What I did in the Air Force was, like I was saying, the equivalent of travel risk management. And this is kind of a picture of how we would accomplish that. This is how you would go through the entire process to make sure that we're addressing this kind of risk, taking care of our travelers, making sure the organization is on the up and up. So if you look at that first section, you've got preparation. This is the programmatic considerations, plans, policies, and procedures. So what do we need as the core? We need a policy, a travel risk policy. It's not enough to have an expense and travel management policy. We need to have certain considerations specifically for the travel risk issues, approvals, risk assessments, not having the certain amount of people on flights, all of these kinds of things, but a policy nonetheless. We need a program document. What are responsibilities of the people managing this program? And one of the things that's critical for something like this is trying to knock down the silos. And I'll talk more about this, but just inherently, because of the breadth that travel has across an organization, it's critical to implement a multidisciplinary management team, committee, whatever you want to call it. But the program document is then going to say who has ownership of this program, and then what are the individual responsibilities of every function that is supporting it. Thank you, Toby. Good to see you, brother. Now, having this multidisciplinary team is going to help us effectively manage this program and also get buy-in across different functions within the organization, whether it's budgetary, participation, bringing those silos down. But this is the picture that we want to create of giving everybody the same unified understanding of how this whole process works. So it's a program document, roles, responsibilities, what are training requirements, how are we going to assess risk on a global basis wherever we travel annually? What does that look like for specific trips? What is the profile of the individuals that are traveling? How are we going to respond to incidents? All of these kinds of things go into this program document. And then there's also the critical piece of this, which is the traveler themselves having something for them where it's their emergency procedures if something should happen, whether it's a basic issue or an extreme issue. Oftentimes in travel risk management programs, one of the things that we see is we implement all of this kind of support structure without thinking through the lens of the traveler. In the military, we call them an isolated personnel, the one that was experiencing the issue and having to get themselves to safety or unlock the support infrastructure to come and help them. So we give them what's called, and this is based upon the standards as well, some sort of emergency action plan. If X peril happens, what are we expecting the traveler to do? And having a documented way for, and this can even be through software capabilities that you have and all the things, but having a way for the traveler to have a mutual understanding with the people that are supporting the safety and security of that traveler for if something happens, what are they going to do? And what is the actions that we're asking the support capabilities, whether this is from the security operations center, if you have one, from your assistance provider, but it's bringing a common understanding of what we're asking them to do. Here's an example of how that rolls out. Let's say that you don't have, as an organization, a good capability to track travelers or monitor their location. And even when we do, sometimes those systems can be a little bit faulty. We're tracking by their airline itinerary or something that is kind of fixated. Well, if we have an understanding of the traveler, of how they communicate, when they communicate, who they report to, and these sorts of things, that is an example of what I'm talking about. Making sure that they understand exactly what to do and when, and how to accomplish that. So that's all stuff that we define in policies and procedures, suffice it to say. Of course, training is a huge part of this. Organizational leadership. So executives, can we give them a defensive security briefing if they're going somewhere? They need to have an understanding of what they're going to be up against. Travelers, we want everybody to have a baseline understanding across the spectrum of the different risks that they would experience, but general travel safety and security principles. How do we protect the organization's information? How do we respond to an emergency if we experience one? All of these kinds of things. Considerations for transit, considerations for hotel safety. All the gambit is what we want to make sure that they're getting in general awareness of. And then as risk increases to the traveler, so should the focus on the training. So an example that we do for organizations is let's say an individual is going to be traveling to a high risk environment, or they're a high risk individual for something happening to them, say an executive. Maybe they're at risk of becoming taken hostage or, express kidnapping, whatever. We want to give them training based upon that risk and give them the ability to practice it beforehand. It's called stress inoculation training. It's called high risk travel training, heat training, some of you might call it. But we need to be able to address their ability to deal with that risk on a greater capacity. So it's kind of based upon the risk. Okay, equipment and technology. I'm going to move along a little bit faster here. What things are we asking to support our program with? How are we monitoring geographic risk? How are we communicating with our travelers? Mass notifications capabilities. Maybe there's even some of you that go to locations where travelers may want to have a satellite phone, and that's permissible in that country. All of these kinds of things need to be defined and clearly articulated within the program. And then we need to have an understanding of all of these things across those three layers between the organizational leadership, programmatic leadership, the cross-functional teams, and the travelers. So these are the kinds of things that we address within the planning, the preparation. The planning phase is, okay, now that we are planning for travel, how are we getting ready for the risk of the areas that we're going to be up against, as well as the risk presented by the individual themselves? So we're kind of looking at this from three different perspectives: geographically, politically, understanding that the lines between government and enterprise nowadays is more gray than probably ever. So if somebody is traveling to, say, Eastern Europe, are they going to be at risk of wrongful detention? Or let's say certain countries in Africa or South America. How are we preparing for these things? Then again, the risk towards the individual themselves. So are we planning these things on an individual level? Me, the traveler, a corporate and organizational level, preparing for these different issues. And then again, at the governmental level, understanding what resources the government has. This is like the Safe Traveler Enrollment Program. This is OSAC, the Overseas Security Advisory Council, for those of you in the United States. But also understanding what is the government's response if something were to happen, and how is the government preparing for these things. A great resource for those of us in the United States, if you want to understand some of the government planning and looking at these different issues, it was just released, and that's the National Security Strategy. If you want to have an insight on what the government's intentions are to deal with these things, that's a great resource. But we're planning for these things. It's trip specific, and it's also programmatically on an annual basis, because things change all the time, as we all know. Execution is when something happens, how are we taking care of the traveler? How are we either getting them back home safely or getting them back onto their trip? Do they get sick? One of the biggest causes of death for travelers overseas when they're traveling internationally is transportation accidents, getting killed in car crashes, say. But we need the individual to report, or we need to identify that something is happening. We need to locate and support that traveler with whatever resources they require or whatever safety and security they need. We're recovering them on their trip and or back home, whichever is applicable. And then we're reintegrating them back into normal life. So we've had journalists, we've had individuals that on the extreme spectrum, when they get taken captive for many years, getting them back into normal life is a significant process. We need to have, as part of our program, the ability to address these travelers and address these individuals to make sure that their psychological and their physical well-being is going to be back to normal as much as we can. But maybe on the lower end of the spectrum, somebody has a sickness or whatever. How are we getting them back into the flow of things, whatever support they need? Maybe it's just kind of having a conversation with them to make sure that we're taking care of business for other travelers, but it's that reintegration of making sure that we're getting the information, the lessons learned, and looking after the well-being of the individual. That's the execution of this. And of course, adaptation is how are we taking these lessons learned? How are we identifying requirements based upon going through this process and then building it back into the program? This is a huge thing that's overlooked. Now, use this example. If somebody is going on a trip and let's say they experience something that's fairly minor, are we maybe just sending them a survey after the trip and saying a couple basic questions? How was your trip? Did anything happen? Do you want to let us know what happened or talk about it? Gathering that information because that traveler was out there experiencing these things real time. That's intelligence that we can use and build it back into the system. That's going to be, direct eyes on some of these issues or direct experiences. That'll be better than any news report, social media report, or anything that we can get. And we reflect that information back into the program. So this is a great benchmark that you can use for your program. It adapts a lot of the guidance from the ISO, but also benchmarks to other resources as well. But if you want to go deeper into this, just let me know. I'd be happy to walk you through. But whether you're trying to protect executives traveling, whether you're trying to protect individual travelers, this is a framework that you can use to make sure that you're looking at travel risk management holistically. All right. Taking all of this information. So we had a lot of these issues. The one thing I wanted to mention on the last slide as well is for those of you that do have concerns specific to executives, ASIS also just published an executive protection standard, which has some overlap with some of these things we just discussed. And there's also another association that's going to be releasing one as well. If you want information on that, I can get it to you afterwards. But there's a lot of guidance coming out for how can we better protect those that are higher risk individuals, such as an executive. So these are the things that we're seeing over 2025. How do we adapt this information and use it to our advantage for 2026? So what is your number one concern for those of you on the call? What's your number one concern for 2026? Security related concern. It's going to be a little word cloud that pops up. Now we'll bring this bad boy in for a landing. Okay, employee safety, very good. Budget constraints, definitely no new things there. Okay, executive protection burnout, that's real. Employee safety, several folks. Layoffs, yep, no doubt. Lots of organizations in the latter half of this year in particular have been doing even mass layoffs. We've been seeing that. And for what that's worth, while we're on the topic, this wasn't part of the discussion, but mass layoffs have been a huge thing and they're unavoidable for organizations that have a lot of people. If you're going through that process from a violence prevention perspective, try to look at the pool of individuals that may be laid off and see if there's any behavioral concerns or concerns for potential threats for the pool of individuals. And for those that might present a potential higher risk, let's do a threat assessment on those individuals. And maybe those particular individuals we do a specific process for, whereas everybody else might be part of the one meeting or however you navigate that process. So a lot of great information here. Insider risk is a good one. Actually, this is part of what I'm going to talk about for looking at 2026. So if we consider the four domains here for security, one of the big ones as it relates to us and the conversation we're having is the people issue. How do we holistically look at people? And this is where I believe the future is going in this industry. So workplace violence, travel risk management, historically, a lot of these programs have been in silos. And where I see the future going in this respect is the safety and security of the individual, regardless of where they're working. How do we accomplish that? Well, some of you may house this already under an insider risk program, but I want to give a few considerations that you can consider for repeating myself here, but a few considerations that you might be able to implement to help lean into the future and how I think some of these issues are going to be addressed for the extended way ahead. Plans, policies, and procedures are obviously going to be the core of all of these different things, but there's monitoring. So what is monitoring? Whether it's a traveler, people in the workplace, people working from home, having a way to monitor location of where individuals are working for those risks. So this is geographic intelligence. Some of you probably already have this, but also having the individual monitoring for those on the move. The key underpinning of all of this is communication. Do we have an effective way to communicate with our people? Whether that's mass notifications, but also here's the kicker of this is a way for employees to communicate back to us at headquarters, the operations center, whoever's receiving that information when things are happening. This kind of relates to training. Do our individuals have an understanding of how to protect themselves for the risks they might experience across the spectrum, but also how to protect the organization? We want to be able to address both of these things. And here's where we get into issues like insider risk. Tailgating. Somebody might think that's the most harmless thing that could be happening to an organization, but if they let the wrong person in, they either ignorantly or negligently may have just exposed the organization and or potentially themselves. So we want to make sure that individuals are trained on the fundamentals of security. Well, this is protection for themselves. This is from things like violence. Maybe if people are out in the field all of the time or dealing with customers, maybe it's de-escalation. Maybe it's how to protect organizational information. Maybe it's protecting facilities. Whatever the risks are, we need to make sure that we're covering the basis and giving everybody an awareness in all of these different things so that at the lowest level, we can have a cultural understanding of how to deal with these issues. Then we create centers of excellence. Now, for those of you that are prior military, for those of you that or have some sort of government background, you're probably familiar with the concept of a task force. Multidisciplinary effort on all of these things into the future is going to be critical. And here's why. We have budget constraints. We have an increasingly data heavy age where we're trying to leverage AI and all of the things. Information in silos isn't going to help anybody. So if we create centers of excellence, using the violence prevention concept, those of you that have a multidisciplinary threat management team, this is an example of that. But having these centers of excellence to deal with each of these different issues. So we identify an owner, and then anybody that has some protective capacity, we have these multidisciplinary teams that address these issues. So maybe, maybe business continuity is looking at the operations and IT side of things for this issue. Maybe security has threat management, but maybe business continuity has a seat on the threat management team and vice versa. That's how we start operating these things. So it allows us to budget more effectively. If we apply these things to organizational objectives, we're going to get better buy-in from leadership and higher level leadership on boards and those sorts of things. But this allows the organization to holistically address all of these different issues that might harm people. The last capability of this is having the ability to respond. Again, a multidisciplinary thing here, but crisis management, emergency management, responding to incidents, whatever the issue is, the thing that you have to be able to deal with or have clearly articulated and identified is how are we going to communicate through this process and who is in charge. One of the biggest issues that we see from a crisis management standpoint is when a bad problem happens that reaches the level of a crisis is everybody starts looking at everybody else for who's in charge. Have that identified, and have that clearly articulated so when things happen, decision making can happen in the most efficient manner. How does this relate to workplace violence specifically, like we were talking about before? Given the regulatory nature, I don't think this is going anywhere. It's always going to be kind of its program unto itself because of the legal landscape that we're experiencing, and this is going to continue into the future. But what you can consider as an organization is housing some of these things under a program such as insider threat, which I think is going to be a big part of the future as well. For those of you that are unfamiliar with insider threat, look at the Insider Threat Mitigation Guide from 2020 published by DHS. It's a wonderful resource. Carnegie Mellon is also a wonderful resource for this, but we're looking at behavioral considerations holistically. It's ultimately looking at human behavior because workplace violence, as it's now defined, is one of the ways an insider might act out. And the way they define insider really makes it so that many people are an outsider anymore because the way they define it, it's an insider is anybody that has knowledge or understanding of an organization. And then the threat piece is using that knowledge to threaten or harm the organization and or its people. There's the workplace violence issue, but it's sabotage, it's cyber, it's theft, uh, and violence is a big piece of this. Like I said, espionage is another aspect of this. So we're looking at these different things from a behavioral standpoint and having these mechanisms that I just mentioned a moment ago to deal with all of these kinds of issues, not simply, keeping them in the silo. All right, last thing here, and I'm going to wrap this up, my friends. How does that relate to us for CPPS? Into 2026, microlearning is going to be a huge thing for us. We're leaning into this. Our clients have been asking us for this more and more. We're going to be doing a TRM suite. We're also going to be doing an insider threat suite into 2026. Those will be out throughout the year. We're starting to dabble in AI for production capabilities. All of our clients, like one individual said earlier, budget constraints are always an issue. So we're starting to use AI for production for more cost efficiency there, helping get this information out to a wider audience. Of course, travel risk management is a huge issue that we're working on clients with, and that's going to continue to be a huge trend for us into 2026 as well. We're going to be developing an entirely new behavioral threat assessment and management course, so be looking for that in the latter part of the year. We're thrilled to have a partnership with RockDove Solutions for those of you that want to operationalize your violence prevention program, have stronger record keeping, security, incident management capability. We have a partnership that will be continuing to build upon with them. And then, of course, our Safe Workplace Unlimited package. If you're unfamiliar with that, I encourage you to reach out to us and just ask about that because we're your partner in this space. We help you meet these compliance issues. We make it easy. We do the heavy lifting, and we're the resource for you. And this takes you all the way through the process, making sure that not only are you consistent with state and federal legislation, but the standards, providing the training, doing so in a turnkey manner, in a budget-friendly manner, so that you as practitioners can make sure that all of these different things that you're having to wrestle with are made easy. And that's our objective for you as a partner in this space. My friends, I want to thank you for coming. For those of you that are still here, we are going to be doing a threat management workshop in February here in Spokane, Washington. We did a workplace violence prevention masterclass a couple months ago. It was the first one we've done in this manner in a long, long time. We had a few dozen people come out, and it was a great time. Go to our YouTube channel if you want to see the panel from that. But I invite you all. We got early bird pricing for this right now if you want to scan the QR code, but would love to have you all join us in February for this. It's going to be myself, Jamison Ritter, our Director of Behavioral Threat Assessment and Management, and we're also going to have another individual joining us on the webpage. You'll see it's a mystery, but I'm going to let y'all in. It's going to be Randy McAllister, a certified threat manager as well. And we're going to delve into all of the threat management issues so that you can take care of these issues, make sure your people are staying safe, and looking after the health and safety of your organization. So scan that. We'll also send it out after this webinar. We got a few minutes left. I'll open it up to questions. We will also be, for those of you before you depart, look at your email. We'll be sending these resources out afterwards as well, probably tomorrow, sometime this week at the latest, but we'll make sure these get your inbox so you can have the retention. Any questions, my friends? All right. Very good. Well, if you do have follow-up questions, always feel free to reach out to me personally, jake.newton@cpps.com. Check out our website if you have questions, or you can submit through there as well. But consider us a resource for y'all. We're here at your disposal. We want to make sure that you all have some of the stress lifted from your shoulders and what you're trying to accomplish on a day-to-day basis. With that, have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you all for what you do on a day-to-day basis in the trenches. And take care, everybody. Have a good one.